Sandra R. Welcome to the Oceans of Learning podcast, celebrating our seas and having a look at the array of amazing marine resources just off our coast. For episode 1, Our Ocean, Our Life, we're looking at marine biodiversity and how the ocean promotes our health and well-being. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you guys today. We have Dr. Aaron Lim from Green Rebel Marine in Cork, Dr. Debbi Pedreschi from the Marine Institute in Galway, and Sibéal Regan from the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group. But first up, we have Dr. Easkey Britton, eminent researcher, speaker, big wave surfer, and the author of just released the amazing new book, 50 Things to Do by the Sea. We will actually have some coveted copies of that to give away, so stay tuned to the end of the episode to find out more. But first of all, Easkey, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. What a lovely celebration.
Yeah, perfectly timed with the book. I love it.
Yeah, and their ocean.
Yeah, and so Easkey and I are probably, in the joys of COVID, are probably not actually that far away from each other. Are you in Donegal at the moment as well?
I'm actually in Mayo.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, where I'm mostly based these days with my partner. He started a small market garden, and we're kind of on the edge of Clew Bay, so close proximity to the sea as well.
Nice. Thank you.
I live between two bays, Donegal Bay and Clew Bay at the moment.
Oh, I like it. That's like two really beautiful bays as well.
Yeah.
I love swimming in Clew Bay, and so I always think your research sits at a very interesting place between I guess ocean health, but also human well-being. And I'm just really curious to know, how did you find that place, if that makes sense, or how did that become your area of interest?
Yeah, I haven't had a kind of linear pathway into being, I suppose, a marine social scientist, and I've only recently there's only recently been the language to describe what I do, where I sit between the more natural marine sciences and then the sort of social and human aspect. I think it came about by a combination of, being a surfer as well. I was so immersed in kind of the front lines of witnessing the changes. You kind of learn to pay attention in a really different way. You're kind of making observations and noticing how other species are responding to changes as well. And so you're feeling very much part of a bigger ecosystem rather than separate from it.
You're in it as opposed to just looking at it.
Yeah. And so then you're kind of bearing witness to change, increasing storms, flooding, erosion, pollution. All of that's like part of the lived experience rather than feeling removed from the everyday and can directly impact us. So that was part of it. And then I think the turning point was going, like I went to university kind of late. I spent maybe 3 years traveling after I finished school, building a career as a pro surfer, and but I kind of wove it in with doing volunteer work around marine conservation and tropical coral reef ecology, and it was amazing. But I just felt at that time those projects were really removed from like the lived experiences of communities dependent on the natural ecosystems, who'd also had this amazing collective wisdom for generations that was being completely untapped and unacknowledged. And I felt any impact in terms of sustainability would be so short-lived if there wasn't the integration of the human dimension. And then even say, with fisheries, fishery science, which I was involved with too as part of my kind of PhD, it's not about managing fish, it's about managing people, so that's how I ended up with that aspect. And then increasingly it was coming almost back to source of intuitively knowing and feeling the healing and restorative benefits of the sea my whole life for myself personally, and then seeing the kind of transformative aspect it can have for different people. And this kind of, in the last, I suppose, 5-10 years, more of a surge around ocean therapy and things like that, and people being called back to the sea and water as a place of healing, which of course, as long as there's been humans, there's been that kind of connection as well with water. But it's lovely that there's this kind of reawakening happening. And so that's where I sit now, I suppose, between looking at the link between ocean health and human health.
Oh yeah, and it's really cool to see it. Like I think even what you said there about kind of looking at communities where they've had a connection with the ocean for a really, really long time, and yet you often feel like scientists now are coming in and like telling them how to do something when they've kind of had this knowledge for a much longer time and maybe have a better way to manage it and stuff themselves as well.
Yeah, I think it's really like what fascinates me are trying to, I suppose, there's these lost connections. So trying to, like, how do we reconnect and restore explore a relationship with like the ocean, sea and coast in a healthy way. And I'm always interested in Ireland, how that's evolving as an island nation and our relationship with the sea over generations and historically. And I just think there's so much, for example, in the Irish language and in Gaelic. It's something I know Mancham Magan has done an amazing job of collecting these words that really speak to like the intimacy we have with place and that ecological understanding and the richness of it that can also be lost. It's interesting, there's no real word for landscape in the Irish. Closest is kind of duchas, which is more akin to belonging to, like belonging to a place, belonging to the sea, belonging to the mountain. I think there's that there to draw upon as we move forward. And there's definitely like so many new narratives coming about our relationship with the sea that are really exciting, especially over this last year.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And like, I think it's an interesting one. Like I know for myself, even just from studying seaweeds, that we kind of had this, we're nearly reconnecting to things we've lost. Like there was a history of people in Ireland eating seaweed, using seaweed for fertilizer. Maybe you're doing this on the farm as well, I don't know. And now it's like we're learning it again. So it's really cool that you're kind of in the forefront of that too, which is nice. So Easkey, obviously you work on kind of many different facets to do with the marine environment, whether it's surfing or in your research. I'm just really curious to know, like, what would your day like, or what would a project look like when you're working on something particular? What's actually going on for you in terms of your work?
Yeah, I think it's one of the exciting things about working in the marine space is that you're in an environment that's crosses so many boundaries. So you work with people in lots of different places with lots of different backgrounds. It's really interdisciplinary. Right now I'm working on a Erasmus Plus funded project called Inclusi. So with 7 different kind of NGOs and another research institute in Portugal across like 5 countries in Europe. And I work really closely with Liquid Therapy, the like non-profit based in Donegal, do a lot of ocean therapy, especially with young people. So it's just really exciting getting to do that kind of more applied research, looking at how to restore the ocean as a more inclusive and accessible space. So Inclusi is looking at, I suppose, methods and best practices around for people with physical disabilities or sensory impairments who want to access and experience surfing. So it's pretty cool.
That sounds like a really cool project. And speaking of really cool projects, you just released a book.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about your book, how it came about, a little bit about what it is about as well?
Yeah, it's called 50 Things to Do by the Sea. So it's kind of on the title. But I wrote it last summer after I finished out my contract at NUI Galway on another project called Sophie on oceans and human health, which was amazing but really intense. And it was a lovely shift to write in a really like fun, creative and accessible way, the understanding of the ocean's influence on us and our influence on it. So a lot of the book is about, I suppose the aim is to connect people with the ocean in a more conscious, sort of mindful way. And also just showing the links, especially for health and well-being, how much we can benefit, how we can do different activities to kind of connect more with it. And also then things we can do for the ocean. So there's just amazing things happening around citizen science and then revisiting like old childhood activities I would have done. So it's a whole mix, but it's really about, for me, about fostering this culture of care and reciprocity. So, receiving so much of the benefit from the ocean and then wanting to give back and how to do that.
Nice. So it's like fostering a sense of stewardship in people.
Yeah.
Very cool. And is it directed towards a particular age group? Is it for everybody?
It's for everyone. Like there's lovely activities sort of around breathing exercises and mindfulness, and then creative ones too, like around photography and sketching and then of course beachcombing, rock pooling, sustainable seaweed harvesting, even having picnics and sandcastles. So the whole lot's in there. So definitely really fun for families and kids. I think it would be interesting even if you're already really engaged with the sea, and but also if you're completely unfamiliar with it, it's a lovely way, I suppose, to learn how to, there's one section in the book that's all about kind of how to read the sea, so around waves and tides and currents and things like that. So it's about building up I suppose a more deeper relationship.
Approach,
yeah Yeah.
I think it's really cool that you've added that as well, because like obviously we've seen in this last year with just the explosion of sea swimming around our coast. So it's really cool that you've added a piece, even just learning how to read the ocean, because as people are getting in but maybe haven't got that much experience with it before, that's obviously a great thing for them for their safety as well.
Yeah, and just acknowledging that you're in an unfamiliar environment, and just having that kind of, well, respect in one level, but just that recognizing that you're when you enter into the sea, you're in a very different world to what we're used to, and you're connecting to something so much bigger than you. So yeah, it's just a lovely way to sort of start to make that a bit more familiar for people.
That's really
Yeah.
cool. And just curious as well. So obviously the year that's in it, we won't talk about it too much, but are there particular, obviously we know you surf and everything like that, but are there kind of like particular ways you like to engage with the ocean that just promote your own health and well-being, especially in this kind of last year?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think like when we're in nature, I feel like we respond rather than react, and water really facilitates that really embodied way of being fully present, especially our cold water here in Ireland. Because it's like, we just know where else your mind is going to be when all like 30 trillion cells are being like stimulated and woken up by a
25
dip
cups
in
of
the
coffee.
sea. Yeah. So I forget the coffee effect. Yeah, and I think what the other thing that's nice, I suppose, in the book too, it was about how to make it as accessible as possible. So whether you just want to be by it or dip your toe in it or get fully immersed, there's something for everyone, but there's also a benefit to be had even before we get in the sea, which is, I think, really important to acknowledge. So there's an activity in it that I love called a sit spot.
Okay.
So, and I definitely found a beautiful kind of sit spot during the first lockdown. It was just down the road from where we lived, and I hadn't noticed it before because I hadn't gone exploring that close to home. So it was forced on me, and it's just magic. This little cove you can't see from the road, and a sit spot is about just going to a place outside in nature. And of course, if you're by the sea, you're just taking in all the benefit the sea has to offer, which is how multisensory it is. We know even like the color, the sounds, the smells all have an effect on our mood and well-being. And the sit spot is simply just about taking that moment to pause and be still and just notice what's going on around you. And it's lovely. The more you go to the same spot over time, just the deeper that connection becomes, and the more you kind of notice. So it's almost like fine honing that art of paying attention, and I find it really grounding.
That's
Especially
amazing.
when you feel kind of, often feeling like the ground's gone from beneath our feet. That's a really nice way just to like reconnect. Yeah.
It's nearly like the yogic idea of like, how many what can you see, what can you feel, what can you taste, what can you smell. Yeah, it's really cool.
Exactly. Yeah. And the sea just amplifies all that and makes it just much more effortless to pay attention to those things. And all of that has a benefit on us, physically and psychologically. And so that's been like the body of my research for this last while too, is kind of drilling into like the why water part. Yeah.
Putting it.
Yeah.
Easy, that's really cool. I hope that'll be a nice takeaway for the listeners to find your sit spot. Is that what you called it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
it. It's brilliant. Well, so kind of on the idea of something that they can take home, is there maybe one thing that you could share with the listeners that they could start doing now even, that would have a bit of a more positive impact on our oceans?
Yeah, I would just love to see the ocean celebrated and appreciated for its influence on kind of every aspect of our lives. Anywhere we are on the planet, there's this notion that you have to be an ocean lover or live on the coast or by the sea to have a connection or any benefit from it. So yeah, a couple of things. And then we're kind of, the challenges we're facing are also interconnected. When we talk about the climate crisis and the need for climate action, we're also talking about ocean action. So that anything you do, for example, that helps reduce your carbon footprint or reduces your waste, nearly all of our waste and pollution ultimately will end up in in the sea in some shape or form. And we've kind of left our mark as humans on every part of the ocean, its entire column, right to the deepest part of the seafloor, which is just incredible. Not to mention changing the very chemistry of entire body of the global ocean. So there's no shortage of things we can be doing and doing now. I think the most important things are, and I talk about them in the book, big and small, anything that helps cultivate just the greater kind of conscious awareness of our actions, and just slowing that down a pace is going to benefit. So in terms of the choices we make, all have an impact on the ocean. But I also think a community building part is really, really important right now. So because it's going to take all of us for the challenges we face. And I think that's something I've been really excited to see, is more people coming together around a shared connection with the ocean, be that, finding a local sea swimming group, or creating a coastal care group with clean coasts, and are doing organized beach cleans, getting involved in habitat restoration. And so I'd say do your homework, find an organization that's doing work that really speaks to you, and see how you can get involved. Because doing it alone, it's not going to work. And if there isn't something in your area, think about starting something up.
Definitely.
So that we can be voices and champions for what the ocean needs, and that really needs to be heard at the highest levels. So the more we can kind of come together, the better.
Amazing. Yeah. Fostering connection. I love it. Easkey, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And guys, remember that her book is just out, 50 Things to Do by the Sea. And if you stick around to the end, we also have a copy or two to give away to find out more. Thank you so much for Easkey.
Yay. Thank you.
Easkey shared some fantastic wisdom with us there on how the ocean can promote our health and well-being. We're going to change tack a little bit now. We're going to be looking at marine biodiversity, habitat mapping, ecosystems management. I'm joined with Dr. Aaron Lim from Green Rebel Marine in Cork, Dr. Debbi Pedreschi from the Marine Institute in Galway, and Sibéal Regan from the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group. Sibéal, I feel like when we look at the oceans around us, we hear a lot about seals and dolphins and really not much else, just fungi himself. Could you tell me a little bit more about the biodiversity you're seeing off the Irish coast?
So thanks, Finn. So Ireland is actually one of the best places in the world to see whales and dolphins. We have huge biodiversity. We actually have 25 different species of whales, dolphins and porpoises found in Irish waters to date. So, when people think fungi or Nemo in Galway, or all these they're normally bottlenose dolphins, and that's one species that we have. But there are loads of other. There's harbour porpoise, which is the smallest coastal dolphin we have. They're tiny, and we also have minke whales, and they have baleen like this. So there's even from the types, there's huge diversity. We have toothed whales. We also have baleen whales. So baleen are filter feeders, and their teeth is made actually from the same material as your hair and nails. It's super weird, and people think, God, they have hairy teeth, but it's used to catch tiny fish and krill. And then we also have large whales. Like we have fin whales, we have blue whales, we have sperm whales. This is a sperm whale tooth. It's the size of my face, if anybody, if there's any ambiguity of how big a sperm whale are, their teeth can be the size of your head. And we've got just massive biodiversity. We've got loads of different types of habitats in Ireland. So there's coastal waters. We also have deep sea canyons as well, which are great for beaked whales, these really elusive species that, if you're just watching from land, you would be unlikely to see a beaked whale, but they're all here nonetheless, and they need protection. So
what ones, maybe if anyone is watching from the coast, is there particular parts of Ireland where you are most likely to see particular species of whales and dolphins, or particular species that maybe are easier to spot?
Yeah, so we always say, no matter, we're an island nation here in Ireland, so no matter where you are, really, you can see whales and dolphins if you look long enough. But there are definitely some hotspots that are maybe there's more activity. So the likes of West Cork are really great. Kerry, Mayo at the moment is having great sightings. anywhere around there. And the kind of the most frequently cited would be the smallest baleen whale that I mentioned, the minke whale. We're getting sightings of humpbacks at the moment, and those can be seen from land. So these are a really charismatic whale that, you know, will put on a show, and you can see them from land from Cork now at the moment, from Kerry. We'll be able to see them in a few months again from Clare. So it's brilliant, yeah. And then you have the regular kind of, we have dolphins as well. So the bottlenose that I was saying, that's the same species that people would be familiar with, fungi, and Nemo, all of those resident dolphins. And then harbour porpoises are very frequently seen around Dublin and Wicklow and stuff. So it doesn't really matter where you are in Ireland. There's marine mammals all over the coast.
And actually, a question I got quite a few times, obviously with the recent press of Dolphin, of fungi, and where is he? Is so obviously he's actually, while he's very famous, he's not the only solitary dolphin around the coast. Could you tell us anything maybe about that behaviour? We're obviously so used to hearing about them being in pods.
Yeah, exactly. So the regular kind of dolphin behavior, you know, they live in intricate family groups. And so it's quite unusual when we get these solitary dolphins. And there's a lot of kind of speculation about where they come from, why do they seek out human contact? Because they definitely do. And it's all really kind of theory. We don't really know. I mean, there's some speculation that maybe they were captive dolphins, or maybe they're post-reproductive. Like fungi was an adult male when he was first recorded in Dingle. So there's kind of thinking that maybe he was post-reproductive and was kicked out of his group because he was no good.
That's a tough one.
So now, you know, we don't really know. There's loads of different options, really. But yeah, there's loads of solitary dolphins. Obviously, fungi, it's not looking great. He's a very old male, and it's very likely that he's passed away.
No, okay, cool. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And actually, you mentioned habitat mapping a little bit there. Aaron, obviously you've worked kind of extensively in that space. I think people hear about habitats or habitat mapping, but what does that actually entail?
Firstly, we have this unnaturally large resource offshore Ireland. It's about 9 times the size of the land mass of Ireland itself. And all dotted along our coast, we have plenty of habitats. And from my own background, and I suppose yourself as well, Finn, there are plenty of cold water coral habitats, and they exist. There's loads of different types. But habitat mapping itself can be broken into various different parts. Firstly, mapping where the habitats are, mapping the types of habitats they are themselves, different parts of the habitat. You could map a particular species that makes up that habitat, or different physical components. So there are lots of different parts, I suppose, to habitat mapping. Go on, yeah.
Oh no, I was just going to ask. So the caveat is, myself and Aaron have been on a few cruises together, and I have a good memory of you're always. So I'm obviously in the biological side, and so a lot of times when I'd look at the computer programs you're using, they terrify me. But I do remember you had one that was kind of like knitting pictures together of cold water coral reefs.
Yeah, that was something I started at the start of my PhD. It was 2D video mosaic, and of course, since then, things have changed. It's now 3D structure for motion, and essentially we take images from remotely operated vehicles. In my case, it was of coral reefs or submarine canyons. We take lots of images with the Marine Institute's Holland 1 ROV. We'd synchronize the images with some navigation, so the position for where the ROV is, and we'd essentially stitch them together. And that produces almost like a Google Earth image where you can walk around the habitats, and we're essentially taking the habitat and bringing it back to the lab in a digital space. And we've recently been working with an artist, funny enough, who's been printing these out, like 3D printing them, so you can actually see them now back in your hand. It's kind of a cool little thing.
Can I ask Aaron? Sorry, is it possible for, you know, when you're describing these like Google Maps type thing, is there an interface that, you know, the general public can look at these and see them and access those kind of 3D images? Like, is it on Ireland's Digital Ocean or anywhere like that?
These now are kind of just created. I suppose they're still in research space, and there are platforms that you can upload them to. Infomar, for example, put some of their little 3D models online. We've created some full-scale 3D models now of coral reefs. We're kind of having issues, I suppose. They're so large, the information is so detailed, it's hard to put them online. but we can make them publicly available to people who are interested. You can open them in a PDF and simply rotate the PDF around, or we can make them in kind of public friendly formats as well, or like little fly-throughs. So I'm happy to chat to anyone who's interested in that.
And actually that kind of leads on to the next thing I was going to ask you about. It was just so obviously you've been creating these pieces, and what kind of applications, like what have other researchers been using them for, or is it even like, has that even started yet, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's kind of been out there for a number of years now. I originally started using them myself to look at reefs at a full reef scale at this resolution, because normally you're looking at 1 meter size pixels, which is still extremely good, but we're now looking at millimeter to centimeter scale pixels, so you can map the individual bits of coral across a reef. And we did that first in 2017. Well, the research was in 2017, but the actual data was from 2011. And we repeated it again a number of years later to look at how the reefs had changed over a 4-year period. And we did notice some changes on the reef. And only just last year, we went back and repeated that. And we now have a 10-year record, and we put down some monitoring stations, which are still currently out there, due to be collected this year. So we're looking at how reefs change and how they respond to things like increasing currents. So these deep water reefs, I suppose, are susceptible to change, just like shallow water reefs, as you well know.
And dare I ask, good changes, bad changes? What are you seeing at the moment?
We're seeing that they are susceptible to changes. There are benefits. There are, I suppose, cons as well. Obviously, there's increased amounts of coral rubble around the reefs, and we also see higher current speeds. And we think the higher current speeds are maybe eroding some of the coral, so breaking it off. But we also see some areas where the coral seems to like these higher current speeds as well. So still a little bit of working on to get to the bottom of that, but some pros and some cons. It's not all bad news.
And so,
we were talking a little bit about biodiversity, and I just wonder, I don't know much about corals myself, so do we have huge diversity in Ireland? Do some species favor the strong currents, and then others, are you seeing one species becoming more dominant in change, or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so another study we had, well, a couple of years ago, we saw that there's kind of these different chains of reefs, and they have different characters when you compare different areas. Some have these smaller polyps, and they're more susceptible to when there's more sediment or more disturbance in the area because they get clogged up. But we actually found that one of these particular species was starting to decline on a reef. And that was also something we found back in 2015. And we're still, again, we have landers down there now, or these monitoring stations that we call the little monstas, that are actually monitoring the changes in these habitats. So we should have more information about that, but we do have a rock star, I suppose, coral called Lophelia pretusa, which I'm sure Finn can tell you all about. But that's like
studies.
Exactly, it's the one everyone seems to know. It's like the famous coral, and we have plenty of it here.
Oh, wow.
And so obviously we're talking a little bit about ecosystems and stuff here. So Debbie, you've got a connection to ecosystems management. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Absolutely. So I work in the Marine Institute, which is links to both Sibéal's and Aaron's work. We've involved with the vessels and Infomar for doing the deep sea mapping, and the IWDG often comes out on many of our surveys, doing survey work there as well. And I actually volunteered for the IWDG for years as well in a previous life. But my role in the Institute is I am part of the ecosystems approach to fisheries management team. So we are tasked with looking at the wider impacts and associations of fisheries and their interactions and the ecosystems in general. And my specific job at the moment is looking at something called integrated ecosystem assessment. So the idea is to look at all of the parts of the ecosystem. So looking at your shallow littoral habitats out to your deep canyon habitats and everything in between, looking at all of your fish species, elasmobranchs, down to your plankton species. So all of the links in the chain right up to your top predators like your whales and your dolphins. And then looking at the actual oceanographic potential physical impacts as well, and benthic impacts and habitats. But then looking at the wide range of pressures that are affecting all of these ecosystems and these different sectors or parts of society that are causing those pressures. So it's pretty complex. The assessments that we're looking at the moment have about 16 different sectors that we're looking at. I think it's 23, 24 different pressures and 28 parts of the ecosystem are the different categories that we're looking at. So there's thousands of potential interactions there, and we're trying to see where are the top pressures coming from, where are the top risks, because obviously, unfortunately, our resources are limited, so we can't manage everything all the time, and we have to make decisions about where we plow in our resources. So we try to identify the areas that are most at risk.
And I guess just for any of our listeners, obviously if you haven't got a scientific background or you're quite curious about all these different ecosystems, always a good way to tie it back is I remember first showing people kind of images of deep sea stuff we were looking at actually from cruises with Aaron, and they'd be kind of like, well, how does that affect me, or how that's so far away from us, and you're like, well, actually, some of the commercial fish species that you're eating, their nursing grounds are actually those cold water coral reefs that are nearly 2,000 meters down. So it does kind of all tie in together. But
yeah. I think a big part of us as a society, excuse me, particularly an island nation like ourselves, we have a terrible habit of looking at the sea as the surface and not thinking about what's below it. And it is very complex. We have all sorts of habitats. We have rocky reefy habitats you have rocky shores, you have sandy shores, and the same continues out for all depths. That's why we have, these coral rocky habitats, and we have sandy habitats. We have everything going on at all different depths of the ocean. And we have canyons that go down thousands of meters, but you also have intense biodiversity on your rocky local shore that you can go and, see all sorts of anemones and things there and engage in them there.
No, yeah, completely. And I think I would totally invite people to go and have a look as well. Was it called the Real Map of Ireland, where you can kind of see just that amazing landscape of our kind of offshore environment, where you're looking at all these like reefs and canyons, and yeah, it looks like what you're expecting to see on land. It's not just this kind of flat abyssal plain that drops off and goes on forever.
Guys, when you look at the real map of Ireland and our seascape, we're actually one of the largest countries in Europe when you take that into account.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We're not a small player.
So when people are thinking, what can the ocean, I'm not connected to the ocean, what can the ocean do? It's one of our biggest resources.
It's a huge resource, and we have a huge impact on it, and we interact with it in many ways that we don't even realize. We have obvious things like, our tourism. We love to go to beaches for our holidays. We love to go visit fishing villages because they're quaint, but we also eat the produce that they create. But we also have indirect things like, our wastewater and our waste cycles in general, and our land-based industry. They have huge outputs into our marine environment that we don't always think about. So it's really important that when we do think about, these top sectors and pressures and things that are going on, we think about the wider system, because there's lots of things that are happening. And when they interact, especially in the context of climate change, that's a lot going on for our oceans to be dealing with. And we gain so much from them. They provide us with a lot of ecosystem services. So it's important for us to remember we can't just keep taking. We have to, protect and give a little bit too.
Debbie, sorry, Finn, can I just add to that, actually, if you don't mind? I do think a lot of that, and just going along with what you said, is out of sight, out of mind. People, they just see the surface. They don't think what's beneath it. And it's not until you go down there and see what's actually there, you're like, oh, wow, this is actually completely different to the last 10 meters that I saw, let alone back at Ireland.
Absolutely.
And one example I have of the impacts that we'd have on our ocean would be when we discovered a coral reef a couple of years ago called the Piddington Mound, which is like quite close to myself. And it was the first time we'd ever seen it, but yet it was already covered with litter. There was litter all over it. So we'd only discovered something that we'd already had an impact on. Mm-hmm. And that kind of it's a bit sobering to think of it that way.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that we can see as opposed to the things that we can't see. There's lots of chemicals and contaminants and things potentially that way. And, temperature changes and stuff, they're not as readily observable. And if we haven't been measuring things there before, we don't know what the changes are since. So, yeah.
Yeah, completely. The contaminants is a really good point, actually, because from a whale and dolphin point of view, everyone likes to go out whale watching and seeing these magnificent creatures, but they're actually the top of the food chain. So they're a sentinel species, which is basically an indicator species. So if you monitor whales and dolphins, they give a good kind of overall view of what's happening in the rest of the system. And the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group in connection with GMIT are working with a PhD student there, Moira Schlingerman, who does contaminant studies on blubber. And she's finding huge amounts of, heavy metals, PCBs, contaminants and stuff in these live animals. So they're taking biopsy samples, which is just a small piece of skin and blubber, and getting huge data from it. But even though they're live and they seem like they're feeding, they're breeding relatively well, they still have these heavy contaminant burdens. That will actually affect the population over time. It'll reduce their calving rate and their calf survivability as well. So yeah, the impacts that we can't see are kind of the silent killers, really.
And the kind of contaminants that you would be seeing, say, in that blubber, like, is that kind of like industrial byproduct? Is it particular heavy metals or?
Yeah, so a lot of it could be runoff from land. Some of the, let's say, pesticides and organic, a lot of those have been banned now, but they're long lasting, so they're still in the environment. They take a really long time to break down, and that's quite dangerous. So even though we might not even be using some of these chemicals and materials anymore, they're still widely in the environment, so they last a really long time. But another thing Aaron mentioned about litter on the corals and plastics. So when plastic breaks down, it never really goes away. It turns into macroplastics and then microplastics. And chemicals can leach out of these plastics as well as they're being broken down by wave and wind energy, action. And those chemicals have to go somewhere, and basically they're absorbed by all the lower food chains, so the plankton, then it's eaten by the larger fish and the larger fish again, and then eventually the whales and dolphins will eat it, or humans will also eat them. When we're eating fish, sometimes we're taking in these toxins that also the whales and dolphins are. So yeah, it's called accumulation and biomagnification. So all these chemicals build up, and then it's left at the top of the food chain.
Yeah, because I guess even though we aren't technically a marine species, we are sitting at the top of the food web with them. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you think about that, if it's affecting the sentinel species like the seabirds and the whales and dolphins, chances are we're eating a lot of the same things, and it'll also affect us. So if there's any doubts of how we're connected, just
I have one more question for you. So for our listeners, just something that they could maybe get involved in now, maybe each of you, like a top tip of what they can do to kind of help our oceans right now. Aaron, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I have been asked this question a few times before, and I definitely think the best thing you can do is to educate yourself. Don't rely on going to chatting to friends and then you come up with your own theories, which is great, but you should actually do your own research and get in contact with experts in the field and ask them what they're actually doing. Look for their latest research. Research is what guides these TV shows that sometimes have spins on them. So go to the direct source and even speak to the authors of those papers.
Definitely. Debbie, what about yourself?
Yeah, I would echo what Aaron said. I think, educating yourself is a huge thing, but I would also add maybe to educate yourself specifically in what's, either your interest area or your local area. I think getting involved in what's on your doorstep is important. And one of the key ways to do that is to get out and see what's going on. So like you mentioned earlier, Finn, go out and do some rock pooling, see what's going on your own seashore, or, go surfing if that's your thing, or go look at the whales and dolphins either from a headland or a boat. There's lots of opportunities. And again, just to echo what Aaron said, with the likes of Twitter these days, scientists have never been more accessible. There is an awful lot of misinformation out there, but it's easy enough to get to real information if you want it. And usually, we're nice, normal people, the vast majority of us. And if you ask us a question, as you can see, we love to talk about it. So don't be afraid to ask your local friendly scientist about their area of interest. They'll only be too delighted to tell you all about it.
That is absolutely true. And Sibéal, what about yourself?
Yeah, I suppose just to drive it home, I'm going to really echo Aaron and Debbie and say, get engaged, get involved. The only thing I can add are some practical tools to do that. So at the moment, there's loads going on for what Debbie was saying about, get out rock pooling, explore your shore. The Biodiversity Data Centre have a great app that can help you identify things, and you can upload your records. So it's really good to, get fully engaged, and you're submitting data yourself. You're a citizen scientist. And the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group, we're releasing our app on the 22nd of May, so you can submit sightings there, get involved too. And also a huge process that's going on in Ireland at the moment is the marine protected areas public consultation with the government. And I would urge everyone as much as possible to really get informed about this process, as well as marine spatial planning, and take part in these public consultations, because once they're over, it will influence legislation, and there's very little we're going to be able to do after that. So we need to push the government, hold them accountable for what they're going to do and say. And there's a great, on gov.ie, there's a questionnaire, kind of like a survey that you can take that will help you get engaged in that process. So please do, it's running for another 2 months. Take part in that, because this is going to inform our conservation and policy for the next several years. So now's the time.
If I can make one more plug, what I might suggest is for people to make it as a first step to getting out there. Everybody has a phone, and you can look at Ireland's marine territory, the real map of Ireland that we were talking about earlier on, through Ireland's Marine Atlas. So it's atlas.marine.ie, and so everybody can have a look at that, and it maps out lots of our different, not just pressures and things like that, but also species distributions in the marine environment. So you can start to get an idea of what's out there. So it can be a really great resource.
It's fantastic. Everybody can be a citizen scientist now, and it's there's apps for everything these days. So
don't put us out of a job either.
No.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Those are some absolutely fantastic tips. I really, really appreciate you sharing those. Debbi, Aaron, Sibéal, thank you so much for coming on Oceans of Learning today. Brilliant chat. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having us.
Great chatting to him.
Thank you so much for listening. Some absolutely fantastic tips there from our guests. Things that you can try out definitely for yourself at home. If you want to find out how to win one of our 3 copies of Easkey book, just head over to my Instagram, saltwaterstories.me, and you'll see all the details for the competitions there. Tune in next week for our next episode, Our Ocean, Our Livelihood, and you can find us anywhere you get your podcasts: Apple, Google, Spotify. Rate, review, subscribe. I'm Finn van der Aar. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oceans of Learning, the podcast celebrating our seas and Ireland's marine resource, is presented by the Marine Institute. To find out more, go to marine.ie.